So after rewatching The Flash in its entirety from Season 1 all the way to the end of Season 5 for the first time ever, I ranked, as you probably saw, every episode of each season individually, and in the end, I made a top 10 worst episodes of The Flash video, so naturally, the next step is to make the top 10 best episodes of The Flash video, and that's what I'll be doing in this video. I'll be ranking the top 10 best episodes of The Flash in my opinion, giving very short reviews of each episode, and in the end, you'll see the score that I give for that very episode. There is a single honorable mention because it does have the same score as the last episode on this list, or the number 10 slot, but I consider it to be slightly worse, so it's not going to be on the list, only an honorable mention. But with that in mind, let's just get into the video, starting with number 10.
Don't let him take any more. Catch me.
This man stabbed my mother through the heart.
This is my fight.
The mid-season finale of Season 1 was definitely the part of the season where the show just started to get so much better. In this episode, we got a pretty great Firestorm storyline with Caitlin and Cisco looking for him, and in the end, he actually shows up as Firestorm, which is all really cool, but that's definitely the least awesome part about this episode. There are some very emotional talks in prison between Barry and Henry, which are some of the highlights of Season 1. They're just always very emotional, always very well acted and written, and this episode has a lot of those. Obviously, the best part of this episode is the fight scenes, the first clash between the Flash and the Reverse Flash outside of the night Nora died, or the short scenes we saw of that before this episode, but this was definitely such an exciting moment where the Flash and the Reverse Flash finally went up against each other, and the storyline that unfolded in this episode was all really, really good. Not to mention that in this episode, it was revealed that Harrison Wells was the Reverse Flash, which was a very good reveal.
You go below 600 miles per hour, it'll explode.
I can't run forever.
It will blow if you stop moving.
Run, 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 run!
Tricksters is a surprisingly incredible episode. I mean, I wouldn't have expected an episode where the main villains are two tricksters, and that is the main focus of the episode, to be in the top 10 list, but this episode is amazing. Not only is Mark Hamill an incredible trickster, obviously he feels like the Joker, but also distinct enough from the Joker to be his own thing. I think Trickster is one of the greatest villains on this show, and definitely in this episode that is true, but also the fact that we see the night Nora died, and we see like that expanded upon. This is the best, this is definitely the best, I think, look at that night. Even to this day, this episode gave us our best look at the fight between the Reverse Flash and the Flash in that night. And in this episode, we got a look at the Reverse Flash's backstory and how he became Harrison Wells, which is just so interesting. And I just think that this episode did so many things right. Also, not to mention that the moment where Barry phases for the first time is just such an awesome moment. In Season 1, when Barry learned new abilities, it was so cool to see. And this episode with Barry phasing for the first time was no exception. So Tricksters, I think, is a great episode and one of the best of the show.
War on Christmas. Oh yeah.
Barry, get him!
Season 2, I think, had the best mid-season finale in the show's history, which is ironic because this episode doesn't really focus around Zoom very much. He's more in the background, and don't get me wrong, that storyline with him and Harry was great, but that definitely was not the best part of this episode at all, and that's saying a lot because this episode, I thought, was so damn good. This episode was just such a fun, very comic booky and cartoony episode that I just think works really well. The Trickster and the Weather Wizard are probably maybe like some of the best recurring villains on this show, like maybe the two best, maybe the three best with Captain Cold, who he appeared in this episode as well. With their plan and how they are going to defeat the Flash, it's so just well thought out, and it just feels like it's ripped straight out of a cartoon, something like Justice League of Unlimited, which I think is so perfect. Not to mention that I think the build up to Wally's debut and his final debut in this episode is legitimately a little bit emotional, as the build up in the last couple episodes, and also Joe and Iris's reaction to the fact that Wally just showed up, it all just makes for such a great episode, and my favorite mid-season finale of the show so far.
He cannot be stopped! What did you do?
He's being erased from existence.
Who are you?
It's me, Mom.
It's Barry.
Season 1 of The Flash was practically perfect, and the ending to the season-long storyline was handled very well as well. This episode has a lot of great emotional moments, like Barry talking to his father, which again, like I said already, that's always emotional. It's one of the highlights of this season, Barry talking to his father in prison, and this episode has one of the more emotional one of those talks, but also, Nora Allen's death is certainly one of the more emotional deaths in the Arrowverse, in spite of the fact that she was already dead this entire time. Obviously, not to mention, the fight scenes between the Flash and the Reverse Flash are great, and the backstory that we learn about Eobard Thawne in this episode, why he hates the Flash, parts of his origin story, it's just so awesome to hear about that. Also, again, not to mention the ending of this episode where he runs into the wormhole. While I don't think that was really paid off well in the next episode, I think it was just such an epic ending to the season, and all in all, this season finale, while not my favorite finale, is certainly really, really great.
I want him to suffer for everything that he's done.
You want revenge? If that's why you're doing this, you will lose.
This episode is my actually favorite finale of this show. The emotional fallout to Henry's death was handled very well. Definitely one of the more emotional deaths of the Arrowverse in the last episode and in this episode as well. The fight scenes here between Zoom and the Flash are great. Zoom turning into a Black Flash was pretty awesome, and I think that while this episode overall was great, maybe it wouldn't have been as good as the first season finale if it hadn't been for that last moment and that last scene, which I think is what makes it better than Fast Enough. In this last moment, Barry goes to save his mother, which the first time I watched it got me just so excited for what's to come in season 3, because Flashpoint is undoubtedly the best Flash storyline, and it's such a cool concept that I really wanted to see how cool that would be in live action. Now, as it turns out, they didn't handle it well at all, and looking back now, it's not as exciting, but the fact that it got me so excited in the first time I watched it, similarly to Lian Yu, it's a very similar situation. Because of that, this is definitely my favorite finale at this point. Maybe then there will be a better one going forward, but as of right now, there isn't.
Some people, they're just born lucky.
Barry, are you okay?
And that twist of fate makes them better.
Oliver Queen, I'm Barry.
Elseworlds Part 1 is my favorite crossover episode, my favorite episode from The Flash Season 5, and the only crossover episode to make it onto this list because of the body swap and because of the fact that this episode was the most Justice League-y episode of the entirety of the Arrowverse. Those two things just made for such an entertaining and such a great episode. Just watching Stephen Amell playing Oliver Queen, but with Barry's personality, costume, and his powers, and vice versa, it was just so damn entertaining and really damn funny as well. But also, Superman showing up for the first time in an Arrowverse crossover was so damn awesome, and Green Arrow, Supergirl, The Flash, and Superman all facing off against one of the most iconic Justice League villains in Amazo. Like I said, made for one of the more Justice League-y episodes of the Arrowverse, and I would say that this scene alone is probably the best Justice League team-up we've ever seen in live action, including movies. So because of all these things, this has to be on this list and fairly high on it, as it's in the top 5.
I promise you, Barry Allen, you will die.
Then face me now! Help me!
Let him go.
The season-long storyline of The Flash Season 1 is probably the best season-long storyline in the whole Arrowverse, as this episode is the peak of that storyline. I mean, just the investigation of Harrison Wells in this episode specifically was just so damn intense, and the fact that Reverse Flash was setting a trap for the Team Flash the entire time while they were trying to set a trap for him, it just worked out so well. And this episode kind of felt like the climax of the season-long storyline, which is the best season-long storyline the Arrowverse has ever given us, and I think because of that, it just works so well, and this episode is practically perfect. And in spite of the fact that it's a random episode near the end of the episode of the season, but not exactly the end of the season, and the fact that it's still this good and it's good as it is pretty damn surprising. But the trap is one of the best episodes of the show ever.
Take my emblem, throw it through the breach, Zoom will come to collect my body, and we can trap him.
Enter Zoom is just such a perfect episode, and I would say 3, 2, and 1, those are the episodes that are perfect. Those are the 10 out of 10 episodes, as The Flash has had 3 10 out of 10 episodes so far, and while Enter Zoom is certainly the worst out of those 3, that isn't really saying much, as this episode is perfect. The first part of the episode where Barry and Dr. Light, or Linda Park actually, are trying to trick Zoom with the rest of Team Flash, that is all very, very fun, very entertaining, and I think it leads up to the intensity of the final couple minutes just so well, as in the end, as Zoom does appear and kicks Barry's ass in the most insane and one of the most intense scenes and greatest fight scenes ever on the show or in the Arrowverse ever. It's just so perfect, and Zoom himself is an amazing villain in this episode with such an incredible threat level, and he's genuinely scary. While that's true for the entirety of the season, it's in this episode specifically where Zoom is just such a badass and scary and threatening villain. So Enter Zoom has gotta be one of the best episodes of the show ever, and one of the 3 episodes that I would say is a perfect 10 out of 10.
He's in a wheelchair? How could he possibly have done that?
You're smart. I mean, you're not that smart.
Out of Time is the highest rated episode of The Flash ever, and I think for good reason. While as obviously you could tell it's not my favorite episode of the show, I understand why it is the highest rated episode, as this episode is perfect. Not only is Weather Wizard one of the best villains on the show ever, who isn't a main villain, the fact that this episode ended up being erased allowed them to do basically anything they wanted, and the reason is because it didn't really have major consequences on the show. So they did things like Barry and Iris kissed, and also Barry revealed his secret to Iris. Eobard revealed that he is who he is to Cisco and even killed Cisco, and David Singh was crippled in the end, which all was just so damn, surprising, and it was such an intense episode. It was just a roller coaster of an episode, but even now, knowing that these things were all going to get erased in the end, it worked so well because these storylines and moments are very intense, they're epic, they're satisfying, and even at times emotional, like with Cisco's death, and all that makes for one of the craziest and most intense episodes of The Flash ever, not to mention that this was the first time that Barry time traveled, which it goes without saying that is incredible. So this episode is again a perfect 10 out of 10, and it's understandably the highest rated episode of the show ever, but there is one episode, and you can probably already tell that it is, that I think it is so low rated on IMDb, and it deserves to be a lot higher, and is my favorite episode of The Flash ever. But before that, let's go over the honorable mentions, which is one episode.
It's my kind of mission.
If we don't use this, Iris is going to die tonight.
I can't believe they turned King Shark into a guard dog.
King Shark. That's adorable.
I don't know how much longer I can hold out.
Iris,
I don't know what to do. I can't save this.
So I just realized that the top 3 episodes in this list kind of share similarities in the name, as Enter Zoom starts with Enter, Out of Time ends with Time, and then Enter Flash Time, it starts with Enter and ends with Time. That's insane. I mean, if they ever make an episode called Enter Time, it's gotta be the best episode in TV history, but this episode, Enter Flash Time, I think is perfect. I think it's definitely by far the best looking episode of the Arrowverse, as the visuals are spectacular, and I don't think that's an over-exaggeration. I think this episode looks amazing. The CGI and all the visuals, which are all very much enhanced by the season 4 suit, it's all just spectacular. Not to mention that the acting in this episode is incredible, from Grant Gustin, John Blankenship, Tom Cavanaugh, and even Violet Bean, as this episode did like wonders for that character and the actress. Both of them improved immensely in this episode, but I also think that the scenes between Jesse and Harry are incredibly emotional, and that's just not even like scratching the surface of what makes this episode so good, or at least as good as it is. The episode, I think, has an incredibly cinematic structure to it, as it feels like a complete movie, even though it's obviously 42 minutes long, not exactly the length of a movie from beginning to end. I just feel like it has such a perfect structure, as it has a beginning, it has an end, it feels like a complete movie. And not only that, but I think the structure to it is just so good, as everything leading up to the climax is perfect. Now, people do complain that Iris came up with the idea to stop the nuke, but that doesn't bother me at all, as I think that in terms of what people knew in the moments they were conscious, there was literally no other way to do this. And while yes, Iris is kind of annoying in this season, I think that it's easy to get past that, as this episode is still perfect. And the moment where Barry actually does this and goes to stop the nuke, runs through the Speed Force, is not only visually spectacular, the music is amazing, and it all fits perfectly in the build up towards it, but it also shows off Barry's abilities in a way that I don't think any other episode of the show ever did, or even would afterwards, so far as Barry just feels so powerful. And this episode definitely recaptured the moment, which is like one of my favorite moments in anything we've ever seen from The Flash or even DC history, as in Justice League Unlimited, when Wally West, aka The Flash, ran around the world and stopped Brainiac, aka Lex Luthor, Brainiac and Lex Luthor. That was the moment that made me such a huge fan of the character of The Flash in the first place, and I don't think the show ever really recaptured that is until Enter Flash Time, when Barry ran through the Speed Force. So all in all, this is my favorite episode of The Flash, and I think that it deserves to be maybe a little bit higher rated on IMDb, as it only has a 9 out of 10, but either way, I think this episode is perfect. And then again, so we're out of time, and Enter Zoom, all 3 of these episodes are practically perfect. So anyway, let me know what your 10 favorite episodes of The Flash is, or at least what your actual favorite episode ever is, and in the comments down below. So anyway, that is my ranking for the top 10 best episodes of The Flash. Let me know in the comments down below what your favorite episode is, or if you have the time, then the top 10 favorite episodes in your opinion. And if you like this video, make sure to leave a like, share, and subscribe, and thanks for watching.